Hello and welcome to Dragonfire Inc. Today's topic is KJV English. This is also known as Early Modern English and Shakespearean English. So real quick, I'm just going to mention that Early Modern English is the more common term for it, and it was a period between Middle English transitioning into what we know as Modern English, and it was between the 15th and 17th century. Two notable works from that time period is the King James Bible, where I get the term KJV, and Shakespeare. And the reason why I'm calling this lesson KJV English is because it was a transition period in our language. So there's a lot of things that were going on at that time that it would be hard to cover in two videos. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to narrow the focus down onto King James version, and then I'm going to explain at the end of these videos that there's going to be some differences when you look at Shakespeare or anything else from the early modern. And just to help put it in perspective, a lot of people use the term like Old English when describing Shakespeare or something similar. Like, oh, Shakespeare's hard because it's in Old English. Well, you know, that's not actually the case. As you can see on the slide here, you've got Old English as a form that's almost impossible to read for people who speak English. Unless you've studied the language, it's not going to be intuitive. Whereas Middle English, here's one version of Middle English, and that's from Chaucer, where you can kind of make out Middle English. The spelling's going to be different. As you can see, it says, "When that April with his showers sweet," I believe is what that says. "The draught of March hath pierced to the root." So spelling's going to be different. Obviously, I butchered that. If you speak Middle English, the vowels were way different than our modern ones. But it's still legible. And so early modern's even easier, and there's two major changes between modern and early modern, and that is our second person pronouns and some verb conjugations. In the first video, I'm going to cover only the second person pronouns, and verb conjugations I'm going to tackle in the second part of this lesson. So second person pronouns are just the different ways of saying you. There's thou, thee, thy, and thine, and ye, you, and yours. So here's a quick breakdown of what is going on with those different forms. It's difficult for modern English readers because we've simplified over time. We've taken all these different forms of you and just replaced them with the word you. And I'll explain why that kind of happened at the end. But for now, take note that thou and thee are your singular forms, ye and you are your plural forms, and thou is your subject, ye is your subject, thee is your object, and you is your object. And we'll explain that in depth in a minute, so don't go running just yet. So here's a chart. All of these tables will be in a link in the description below, so you can feel free to pause, open that link, print it out, or just pause and write it down yourself. But here I have bolded the major changes between our language and the early modern language. So thou and thee, thy and thine, thyself are all obviously new to a modern speaker. There's going to be a little bit of change with my and mine, which I'll talk about, and then with plural, it's almost exactly the same. The only change is the subject form of you is ye. It's not you. So subject, verb, and object are just ways of defining parts of a sentence. And the simplest form of a sentence in English is going to be in that order, SVO, subject, verb, object. So I've identified here in this short little sentence that Sally is your subject, ate is your verb, and breakfast is your object. That's why you have that SVO. And that's not, obviously we switch things around a lot in English, But this will be your simplest form of a clause. It will be your simplest form of a sentence, and it's a method and a form that we follow naturally all the time. So again, Sally being the subject, ate the verb, and breakfast the object. It's going to be important that you understand what a verb is before jumping into this lesson, because you have to be able to find your verbs in order to identify what your subject is and your object. The other way you could do this is realize that we don't change our subject and object with you anymore, but we still do that with he and him. We still do that with I and me. If you go back to the chart, you say I for subject, me for object. You say he for subject and him for object. So if you get lost, you can always just substitute he. It's a little bit easier than using her, because her is a little complicated. You got she, her, and her instead of he, him, and his. So I just use he. It's a little bit simpler to look at that way. So here's some subject forms just so you get the idea. Thou atest breakfast, that's singular, thou, you, versus ye ate breakfast, that's plural, or he ate breakfast. You can just throw the he in there. You know that it's he and not him, so you should be able to identify that's your subject, that's thou, that's ye. Same thing goes both ways. So subject is your upper portion. We have he owned a vehicle. This should be second nature to English speakers. He owned a vehicle. Thou lostest the key. You'll notice that our verb is changing when I'm using thou. We'll get into that in the second video. But for now, just kind of notice that it's changing because of thou. And then ye landed on your feet. That's all of you. All of you is how we would say that in modern English. All of you landed on your feet. Ye landed on your feet. So now the object form, that vehicle belongs to him. Easy. We're changing it because it's an object and it's him. Now we are going to say, I have already given it to thee. That's singular, thee. He only tried to help you. And that's how we would say it today. But you got to remember, it's just one form out of 4. So that is correct in the early modern as well. And notice as well that to him, to thee, these are following a preposition. So you would say, to him. You would never say to he. The same thing goes with your object forms of you. And ironically, this is also how you can tell if you're using who versus whom correctly. You would say to whom. You wouldn't say to who, because it's the same rule. Now we're going to look at possessives and reflexives. I know this is a lot. We're going to go back and do some practice in a bit. But possessives are just your, so it belongs, it's showing possession there. And then reflexives is like yourself. The only change, your and yours, is used exactly the same as modern English, but yourselves is going to be the only form there. You can't say yourself because your is plural, self is singular. So you're going to say thyself instead of yourself, and yourselves if you're talking about a group. And that might be a good way to remember singular versus plural, because thyself is kind of well known. There is a bit of a hitch here. Thy and thine are going to change depending on what the subsequent word is, like a and an. So they're going to change depending on if the next word is going to start with a vowel or a consonant. So thy is going to be what we use before a word that starts with consonant sound. So thy countenance, thy face, thy name. This is also where my and mine are slightly different than modern usage, because the same rule applies. You would say my face and my name, But with vowel forms, you would say thine ear, thine own desire, thine author, or mine ear, mine own. Same thing. Luckily, they're very similar words, my and mine, and thy and thine, so it should be easy to remember once you get this down. The hiccup comes in when you're talking about a word beginning with H. So H is kind of flexible in English, and you'll see this with A and an. We do the same rule. You would say a countenance or an ear. That's why I keep bringing up a and an. So if you're an English speaker, you already got this down, I promise. But the H sound is going to be different depending on what dialect you're speaking from. In the US, we use a lot more. We pronounce our H's a lot more than in the UK. So I hear and so I read. I don't know very many people from the UK, so I can't speak from experience. But so we can see this rule kind of happening with the phrase, and again, this is US English, an hour and a half. You use an hour because there's no H sound, but a half because half has the H sound. So what you need to keep in mind is, first, the King James Bible and Shakespeare are UK English. So you'll see an in front of an H a lot more often than you would if you're from the US. The second thing you need to keep in mind is that all through Middle English, all through this kind of transition period, we became more and more consistent in our language, in our spelling. That wasn't really the case with Middle English. That wasn't really the case with early modern as much as today. So you will see both forms, an heart and a heart, in the King James Bible and in Shakespeare. And that's very common. You'll see it just kind of thrown away whichever way they felt like writing it at the time, I guess. So thy heart, thine heart, or my heart, mine heart, depending on just what the sentence needed. And so what you want to keep in mind, if you're here to learn how to write an archaic language, then you're going to want to keep it consistent. Modern readers, modern publishers want consistency. That's why we standardize our spelling as much as possible, our punctuation, everything. So if you're going to say something with an H word and it's going to start with an A, then keep it consistent. If it starts with an A heart, then you would say thy heart, my heart. That's how you'd say it in the US English. But if you, in your dialect, say it in an heart or an heritage, you would say thine heritage, mine heritage. You know, obviously I'm not saying that with the correct accent, but you get the idea. So just keep it consistent across the board. All right, so one more caveat with possessives. We do this with mine already in our modern language, and the same rule is going to apply for thine. If you're using a sentence and the possessive is the object as well, you're saying like all of these things are mine, you're going to use mine. You wouldn't say all these things are my. Same thing goes with saying all of that is thine. You wouldn't say all that is thy. So here's a quick verse. It uses this rule a lot, so I thought it was kind of perfect for this grammar. I'm just going to read it to you just so you're kind of familiar with that usage. I pray for them. I pray not for the world, but for them which thou hast given me. For they are thine, and mine are thine, and thine are mine, and I am glorified in them. So all those usages are thine and mine, and it's exactly the same as how we would use it today, except we have that singular you. Now in this case, we would say yours if it was plural. But you already know how to do that because you speak English. All right, so now we're going to transition into a little bit of practice. Feel free to pause these and fill them out yourself in your own head, or just follow along. I'm going to go through it word by word and then read the whole thing aloud so you kind of get an ear for it. So first sentence, but blank have despised the poor. In this example, all of these words are going to be plural. So they're plural, second person pronouns. But blank have despised the poor. This is using your subject, verb, object order. So we've got have despised working as your verb, and then the poor as your object. It's subject, ye have despised the poor, ye being your subject form. Do not rich men oppress blank. So again, identify your verb, it's oppress. Rich men comes before the verb, that's your subject, and then oppress you, object. And draw blank. Here's your next verb. The rich men are still, they're oppressing and they're drawing. So that subject hasn't changed. But draw you, object. So oppress you and draw you before judgment seats. And do not they blaspheme that worthy name by which blank are called. So whenever you're looking at this, you're going to identify the verb for your clause, for your phrase, and having something like which, having a comma before it, ignore all the other verbs, just look at that little phrase, that little clause. So we have by the which blank are called. So are is our verb, right before it is our subject. So ye are called. Here it is all together. But ye have despised the poor. Do not rich men oppress you and draw you before the judgment seats? Do not they blaspheme that worthy name by which ye are called? By the which, sorry, that's a little bit weird to read out loud. And here's the next example that we're going to go through. This is going to be your singular pronouns, so thee and thou, and let's jump into it. And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, of every tree of the garden blank mayest freely eat. Remember I mentioned that thou always has that weird ending? So thou mayest freely eat. Mayest is your verb, thou is your subject, and object is your freely eating. But of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, blank shalt not eat of it. So remember, look at that comma. You're going to narrow it down. Here you have blank shall not eat of it. Shalt not, sorry. So here's your verb shalt, and right before it again is your subject. So thou shalt not eat of it. For in the day that blank eatest thereof, eatest is your verb for that phrase because you have that right before it. That thou eatest thereof, again it's your subject right before your verb. And then that, or therefore, for in the day that thou eatest thereof, blank shalt surely die. So again, it should look very similar to earlier. You have shalt and shalt. Thou shalt surely die. Thou shalt not eat of it. And if you know the 10 Commandments, that's going to sound very familiar. So all of these were subject form. And I wanted to kind of start us off easy with these singular ones because they are abnormal to us. But here it is all together. And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, of every tree of the garden thou mayest freely eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil thou shalt not eat of it. For in the day that thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die. All right, so here's another practice with the singular pronouns. At that time, Jesus answered and said, I think blank. So we got that comma there. We're just going to ignore everything that comes before it. I think blank. That's our phrase. So we've got subject, I, think, our verb, and you, our object. So I thank you, O Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because blank hast hid these things from the wise and prudent. So hast is a abnormal form of have or has, and you're not familiar with it because it follows thou. Just remember that weird ending, there's probably a thou before it. So, because thou hast hid these things from the wise and prudent, and hast revealed them unto babes. Notice that our subject way up here at thou is still affecting the verbs in the second half of this sentence. Even so, Father, for it so seemed good in blank sight. So modern terms, we would say your sight. This is the possessive form, but in singular, that is thy sight. All together. At that time, Jesus answered and said, I thank thee, O Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because thou hast hid these things from the wise and prudent, and hast revealed them unto babes. Even so, Father, for it seemed good in thy sight. Alright, so that concludes the lesson for this video. In the next video, we're going to talk about verb conjugations, but you should take a moment, make sure you understand your table if you downloaded it or if you wrote it down. You might want to go back and just double check that you have that to reference for the next part. And I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you will join me for the next part of this video.